Welcome back. Um, by the time this year comes to a close, global government debt is forecast to cross a really staggering threshold. We're talking $100 trillion.
Wow, yeah, that is a massive number.
Right. It's huge. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the pretty alarming exponential rise in global sovereign debt. We're going to figure out exactly why the world is borrowing so much money, what actually happens when the bill comes due, and most importantly, how this impacts your everyday economic reality.
Yeah, and it really does impact you, the listener, in ways you might not expect.
Exactly. Now, before we jump in, just a quick note on how we're approaching this today. Covers some major, often highly debated policies across the political spectrum.
Right, particularly regarding recent U.S. budget proposals.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to be super clear. We are simply looking at the raw economic math, the historical data, and the market projections. That's it. Just the numbers, no sides taken. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint.
Absolutely, just following the math.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at where we are historically, because the baseline here is kind of shocking. For developed countries right now, the average ratio of public debt to GDP has climbed all the way back to where it was in 1945.
Yeah, and that is a remarkable baseline to start from. I mean, you don't reach 1945 levels of debt by accident.
No, you definitely don't.
You have to remember what 1945 was. It was the immediate aftermath of 2 world wars and the Great Depression.
Right.
To get back to that level of absolute financial strain today required a cascading series of massive global shocks.
It really was a cascade, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it started with the 2008 financial crisis, right? Which demanded just immense borrowing just to keep the global financial system from totally collapsing.
Right, we had to bail out the system.
Exactly. And then, just as things were somewhat normalizing, boom, the pandemic hit.
Which changed everything.
And that was followed almost immediately by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which triggered massive energy subsidies, huge defense spending. Governments basically had to open the taps and just leave them open to keep their economies afloat.
But there was a major enabler that made all of this borrowing feel, completely painless. At least for the better part of a decade.
Oh, absolutely. The low rates.
Yeah, we had a solid 10 years where interest rates were historically low. And in many places, they were continually falling. It was essentially like a government having a credit card with a 0% interest rate.
That credit card analogy is spot on.
Because when the money is virtually free, the culture of spending extends far beyond just managing those emergencies.
Right. When there is no immediate penalty for borrowing, structural spending just naturally expands. Exactly how this played out recently. Last year, 2024, was the biggest election year in world history.
Oh, yeah. I remember seeing that stat.
72 countries. That represents half of the entire global population. They all held elections. And structurally, what happens in an election year?
Politicians spend money to win.
Exactly. They spend to win, and once they're elected, they have to spend more money to fulfill those massive campaign promises. You layer that on top of the trillions being directed globally toward climate change initiatives, the massive subsidies in Europe to shield consumers from spiking gas prices.
Yeah, right, the European energy crisis.
Yeah, and rapidly rising military budgets due to all these geopolitical tensions, the spending just became completely baked into the system.
Which brings us to the plot twist.
The painful part.
Very painful. Post-pandemic inflation spiked violently around the world.
Yeah.
And to fight that inflation, central banks globally had to step in and aggressively push interest rates up.
Right.
Suddenly, that era of free money just evaporated. Any new debt that governments issue today is vastly more expensive to service. But the critical disconnect here is that even though the cost of borrowing skyrocketed, governments haven't put the credit card away.
Not at all.
The budget deficits around the world are projected to just keep growing, completely ignoring the higher interest rates.
And that disconnect is precisely what is triggering a massive reaction in the financial markets. The market is stepping in where the politicians won't.
Yeah, I was looking at how this reaction, and it brings up this fascinating concept of the bond vigilantes. How exactly do they force a government's hand?
So the term bond vigilantes was coined back in the 1980s by an economist named Ed Yardeni.
Okay.
He used it to describe investors who essentially take the law into their own hands to punish reckless government spending.
But they aren't literal vigilantes.
No, of course not. They are institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers. But if they perceive a government's policies as inflationary or fiscally irresponsible, they do something very simple. They sell off the bonds they own, or they simply refuse to buy new ones at the current price.
Which hurts the government.
Exactly. Because when demand for those bonds drops, the price of the bond falls. And in the bond market, when prices fall, the yield, meaning the interest rate the government has to pay to attract buyers, goes up. It is a cold mathematical enforcement of fiscal discipline.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to look at a real-world example of this going wrong. Japan is usually the poster child for massive debt. How are the bond vigilantes reacting over there?
Japan is the ultimate cautionary tale right now. They have the highest public debt to GDP ratio in the entire world, sitting at over 240%.
240%? That's wild.
It is. And for context, that ratio was only around 50% back in 1990.
Wow.
Their massive explosion in debt was driven by decades of huge stimulus packages attempting to fight off persistent deflation. Combine that with a hyper-aging population demanding massive healthcare and pension spending, all while economic growth was basically stalled.
And for years, they got away with it.
Because their central bank pinned interest rates at or below zero. But recently, the bond vigilantes woke up. Japan saw the weakest demand at a government debt auction in over a decade.
And that lack of demand drove their 40-year government bond yield to a record high of 3.7%. Now, to you, the average person listening, 3.7% might not sound like a catastrophic number.
Right. It sounds pretty low compared to a standard mortgage.
Exactly. Detail from the Financial Times about the mechanics of this. Because the starting yield was so incredibly low to begin with, that sharp rise to 3.7% meant investors holding those bonds lost almost 20% of their principal investment in just a few weeks.
Yeah. That is a staggering wipeout in an asset class that is supposed to be the absolute safest place to park your money. And it has created sheer panic over there, which leads to bizarre market anomalies.
Like the situation with their 35-year bonds.
Yes, this is crazy.
Normally, in a healthy market, the longer you lock up your money, the higher the interest rate you demand. A 40-year bond should pay more than a 35-year bond. But right now in Japan, there's an older bond issued 5 years ago with 35 years left on it that is actually yielding a full percentage point more than a brand new 40-year bond. That makes zero mathematical sense on the surface.
It makes no sense until you understand liquidity risk. That 35-year bond is what traders call off the run.
What does that mean for a normal investor?
Think of it like buying a highly customized house versus a standard cookie-cutter home in a popular neighborhood. The custom house might be great, but it is much harder to find a buyer for it if you need to sell quickly.
Oh, I see.
Investors are absolutely terrified of getting stuck holding a bond they might not be able to sell as the market collapses. So they're demanding a massive premium, that extra full percentage point, just to take on the risk of holding an illiquid asset.
And this fear isn't isolated to Japan. We are seeing these tremors globally.
The contagion is very real. Look at the United States. Recently, the U.S. Treasury held a $16 billion auction for 20-year bonds, and the demand was surprisingly soft.
Which the market hates.
Totally. That single-week auction was enough to spook the markets. The stock market sold off, the dollar dropped, and Treasury yields spiked. It was a clear signal of market exhaustion.
It even prompted Moody's, the last of the major rating agencies to do so, to downgrade the U.S. government's credit rating. They explicitly cited the ballooning debt and the total lack of a credible plan to resolve it.
Yeah.
At one point, we saw the 30-year U.S. Treasury yield push above 5%.
And we are seeing the exact same dynamic in the UK and China. The UK's 30-year government bonds spiked to 5.54% amid projections of a massive deficit this year.
And China too, right?
Yeah, China, a country that historically has strictly capped its official deficit at no more than 3% of GDP, has now breached that self-imposed limit 3 times since 2020. They even set this year's target at 4% to try and stimulate a slowing economy.
So everywhere you look, the debt is rising and the vigilantes are driving up the cost to service it.
Which brings us to a really crucial question about the mechanics of all this. Who is actually holding the bag? Who owns all this debt? Let's look under the hood of the U.S. balance sheet.
There is a very common misconception that all U.S. debt is owned by foreign countries.
Oh, you hear that all the time.
Constantly. But the data shows that 80% of U.S. government bonds are held domestically by Americans and only 20% by foreign entities.
And of that domestic 80%, nearly a quarter is held by the Federal Reserve itself.
Wow.
The rest is sitting in mutual funds, state and local governments, pension funds, insurance companies, and local banks.
They hold it because U.S. Treasuries are fundamentally treated as the bedrock of the global financial system. It's supposed to be the ultimate safe haven investment.
But the safety of that bedrock depends entirely on how the government manages its budget. And when you look at the spending breakdown, you realize how little flexibility there actually is.
Yeah, let's break that down.
More than 60% of the U.S. budget goes toward mandatory spending. That is, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That money goes out the door automatically unless Congress literally passes new laws to stop it.
Which is very hard to do politically.
Almost impossible. Then about 28% goes to discretionary spending. That's what Congress actually debates and authorizes every year. And half of that discretionary slice goes straight to defense.
So the remaining piece of the pie is just paying the interest on the national debt. And that interest piece is the jaw-dropping statistic of this entire deep dive. Last year, the U.S. spent $880 billion solely on interest payments.
Just massive.
Just to put that into perspective for you, $880 billion is more than the government spent on Medicare.
Yeah.
And it is more than it spent on the entire military.
What's fascinating here is a point made by financial historian Neil Ferguson, issued a profound historical warning. He said, any great power that spends more on debt servicing than on defense risks ceasing to be a great power.
That is a chilling quote.
It really is. When you are spending more just to tread water on your past borrowing than you are on securing your future, the structural foundation of your economy is cracking.
And the math behind this is a trap.
Yeah.
Even if the U.S. magically balanced its budget today and completely stopped adding any new debt, that $880 billion interest figure is still mathematically hardwired to grow.
Think about it like having a massive mortgage that you locked in at a 2% interest rate. Eventually, that term expires and you have to refinance. The vast majority of the current global government debt was borrowed years ago when rates were near zero.
Oh, I see.
As those old, cheap bonds expire, the government has to issue new bonds just to pay the old ones off. And those new bonds carry today's much higher interest rates, around 5%.
So even if the total amount of debt stays exactly the same, the cost to maintain it doubles or triples. The interest expense simply eats up more and more of the federal budget. Yeah. If we look at the actual math and projections regarding the political solutions being proposed, a very stark picture emerges. Now, again, as we said at the top, we're just looking at the independent projections here.
Right. Totally impartial.
We have the new U.S. administration's legislative centerpiece, what they call the One Big Beautiful Bill. The administration claims this legislation, paired with aggressive pro-growth policies, will manage to cut the fiscal deficit in half by the end of their term, massively boost real economic growth, and eventually balance the budget.
However, when independent groups model out those exact same policies, they arrive at a vastly different reality. Right now, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects that without major changes, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio will hit a record 125% in the next decade. But when the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget evaluated the administration's new bill, they estimated it would actually push the national debt even higher, to 129% of GDP.
Oh, wow.
And the Center for American Progress modeled a very common Washington scenario, looking at what happens if the bill's temporary tax provisions are made permanent. They warn that under that scenario, the debt could skyrocket to double the size of the entire economy by 2055.
Double the size of the economy. That's a massive gap between the political promises and the independent projections. And that gap usually comes down to assumptions about government efficiency. The newly proposed Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, made incredibly loud claims about slashing trillions in wasteful spending to balance the books.
But the receipts haven't matched the rhetoric.
Exactly. The BBC analyzed the data provided by DOGE and could only verify a fraction of the savings, just $32.5 billion.
And as CBS highlighted, cutting government spending isn't free. There are severe offsetting costs. When you factor in the expenses of rehiring mistakenly fired workers, defending against a wave of breach of contract lawsuits, and paying out massive severance packages, those operational costs actually amounted to $135 billion.
You don't even need to rely on media analysis. You can look directly at the U.S. Treasury Department's own ledger. Despite all the claims of unprecedented cost-cutting, total federal spending over the last 2 months is actually up 7% year over year. The math just isn't materializing.
And another core pillar of the proposed math relies on tariffs. The administration is proposing massive import taxes, like a 50% tariff on EU goods and a 25% tax on foreign-made electronics.
The stated goal being to force manufacturing back to the U.S. to stimulate domestic growth and generate revenue.
Yes, but brilliant insight from financial writer Robert Armstrong regarding the paradox of this strategy.
The ultimate paradox here is that by trying to force wealth back inside its borders, a country might actually be making its own capital less productive. It's effectively making itself poorer.
Exactly. Armstrong points out that human and financial capital left domestic manufacturing for a reason. It wasn't the most productive use of those resources in a modern service and tech-driven economy.
Right.
If you use tariffs to forcibly redeploy capital back into manufacturing, you are moving it away from what it is currently doing highly successfully. Less productive use of capital means slower economic growth.
Plus, there is a massive demographic headwind blocking this entire strategy. The U.S. has an aging population and a historically low birth rate. Even if you mandate that the factories be built without significant immigration, there simply aren't enough working-age people to staff them.
Yeah, it is an economic plan fighting a demographic reality.
And on a global scale, J.P. Morgan estimates that this kind of aggressive retaliatory trade war could reduce total global GDP by a full 1%. When the entire world is drowning in debt, actively shrinking global growth makes the weight of that debt mathematically heavier for everyone.
It forces us to confront the fact that a major paradigm shift has happened in economics, and the policies just haven't caught up. Just a few years ago, in 2019, Olivier Blanchard, an MIT professor and former chief economist at the IMF, popularized a theory that governments loved.
What was the theory?
He argued that as long as the interest rate a government pays on its debt is lower than the economic growth rate of the country, huge debts are not actually dangerous. The growth naturally outpaces the cost of the borrowing.
But the grim reality is that Blanchard's theory relied entirely on a world of near-zero interest rates. With 30-year borrowing rates now sitting above 5% and economic growth struggling to even come close to that, his theory is completely dead in the water.
And the major financial institutions know the math has broken down. The IMF issued a highly urgent warning in their October Fiscal Monitor report. They highlighted that global debt is now 10 percentage points higher than it was right before the pandemic.
10 points.
And they explicitly stated that countries whose debt is on an unstoppable upward trajectory account for 2/3 of the world's GDP. The IMF is calling for incredibly painful, immediate fiscal adjustments, meaning massive tax hikes or deep spending cuts, just to bring the debt down.
Yeah, and they warn that every single day governments delay taking action, the required fixes become exponentially more painful. So what does this all mean? How does a country actually escape a debt burden of this magnitude once it is locked in? History really only gives governments three ways out. Option one is to simply grow out of it.
Right, which is the bet the current U.S. administration is making. Expand the economy so rapidly that the debt naturally becomes a much smaller percentage of the total pie.
But as we've just unpacked, achieving massive sustained economic growth is nearly impossible when you are fighting the gravity of 5% interest rates, retaliatory global trade wars, and a declining, aging workforce.
Which leads to option two, austerity.
It's a scary word.
It is. This means a government aggressively slashes its spending, pensions, reducing services, and significantly raises taxes to actively pay down the debt.
But historically, that's political suicide.
Oh, 100%. Governments almost never do this voluntarily. It is usually forced upon them during a severe, catastrophic financial crisis. And from a political standpoint, politicians despise austerity because the immediate economic pain happens on their watch.
Right. It practically guarantees they get voted out of office in a landslide.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the long-term benefits of a balanced budget accrue to whatever politician replaces them years later.
Which leaves option three, inflate it away.
The sneaky default.
Yeah, it's a sneaky way to default on your debt without ever officially declaring bankruptcy. Because if a government prints money and allows inflation to run hot, the currency itself loses value. So they are paying back their massive trillion-dollar debts using dollars that are suddenly worth a lot less than when they originally borrowed them. The real purchasing power value of the debt drops.
It sounds like a clever accounting trick, but there is a massive catch. As you have all intimately lived through over the past few years, everyday voters absolutely despise inflation.
It destroys their life savings.
Vaporizes their wage gains and ruins their daily cost of living. Governments that let inflation run out of control to save their balance sheets are swiftly and angrily thrown out of office by the population.
And more importantly, to our earlier point, the bond vigilantes hate inflation just as much because it eats into their fixed returns.
Oh, absolutely. If the market senses a government is trying to intentionally inflate away its debt, those investors will dump the bonds, driving borrowing costs to truly catastrophic, system-breaking levels.
It really feels like the global economy has painted itself into an incredibly tight corner. To summarize everything we've unpacked today, the era of free money is definitively over. The unprecedented global shocks that drove our debt back to 1945 levels have mostly passed, but the structural spending hasn't stopped.
And now the bond vigilantes are waking up from a decade-long slumber.
From the collapsing 40-year bonds in Japan to the remarkably weak Treasury auctions in the U.S., the market is finally taking away the credit card and demanding fiscal discipline. The rules of the global economy are changing in real time, right in front of us.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really changes how you should be consuming financial news. When you are trying to evaluate the actual health of the economy or figure out the reality behind a politician's promises, don't just look at stock prices, and definitely don't just listen to the speeches.
What should they do?
You need to keep a very close eye on the bond market. Watch those government bond yields. Because while politicians can make absolutely any claim they want about efficiency, tariffs, or growth, the bond market is where the true, unforgiving cost of these policies is being tallied in real dollars and cents.
That is fantastic advice. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We've seen today that the traditional escapes from massive debt, rapid economic growth, severe austerity, or intentional inflation all appear to be either politically toxic or structurally impossible in our current landscape. If none of those three historical levers can actually be pulled without breaking the system, will the world eventually be forced to completely redefine what money and sovereign debt even mean in the 21st century?
That is the trillion-dollar question.
It really is. It is a question that the next decade is going to force us to answer, ready or not. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We appreciate you taking the time to navigate these massive economic shifts with us, and we'll catch you on the next one.